This is my CMS Assessment 2.0, which I built out using Canvas. This page actually represents my entire assessment. Each of these buttons links to a different part of the assessment. Part 1 is the quiz that I demonstrated in my last blog post. That hasn't changed at all. Part 2 links to a page where students get instructions on how they can utilize this project in Scratch Junior, where they sort objects based on their properties of color or texture. Each of these triangles represents a voiceover of the instructions so that students that have difficulty reading can be supported as they read those instructions. After you sort all 8, finally part 3 links to instructions on how to design their very own doghouse to keep a dog warm and dry. They choose their materials, defend their choice of materials, and draw and label a picture of how they would design the doghouse. As I describe in pretty great detail in my CMS Assessment 2.0 analysis, this assessment meets many next generation science standards and Common Core English Language Arts standards. For each of the standards, I have listed the standard and then described which part of my 3-part assessment meets that standard and how it's met. When I began creating this assessment for CMS Assessment 1.0, my plan was to create a summative assessment, a quiz that would act as a post-assessment. However, based on best practices, I will give this assessment before the end of the module. If students do well, then we'll move on to the next module. If students are not successful, scoring 70% or better, I will use this assessment as a formative assessment. I'll either work with individual students who need additional help, or I'll reteach the entire class as necessary. Once I determine that students are ready to attempt the assessment again, I'll only require them to retake the parts that they didn't answer correctly for part 1 or attempt successfully for parts 2 and 3 the first time. Although this assessment is designed as a summative assessment, an assessment of learning, students may still learn from completing the assessment. Once they answer the 15-question quiz in part 1, they get immediate feedback that shows them the correct answers for the 13 multiple choice format questions. After carefully considering my initial CMS Assessment 1.0 and comparing it with Rubric 4.0, I made several changes to CMS Assessment 2.0. Partly that's because my Rubric 4.0 is based on my project-based learning best practices. I designed Rubric 4.0 based on what I would expect to see in a project or an assessment that's based on project. When I initially created Assessment 1.0, being a quiz, it didn't meet several of these criteria. By going back and adding part 2, the Scratch Junior sort, and part 3, designing a doghouse, I ultimately did meet many more of my criteria, and I described those in great detail in the document that I linked to in my blog post.